What's up everyone, KiteTCG here, and today we are back after almost 10 years. Different language, different game. It's like it's a whole different channel. I'm sure nobody cares. Um, so, I've been playing Magic, and I've been playing Commander for, I would say, 5 to 6 years now. It was end of 2019, half of 2019 when I started. And I would like to show off all my paper decks because I'm currently playing 9 decks, and I thought it would be nice to show them in videos and make use of this abandoned channel because why not? My favorite playstyle is Dimir Control. So what better deck to show off first than Mirko, Obsessive Theorist. Now for those of you who don't know Mirko, Obsessive Theorist, it's a 1/3 vampire detective. It costs 1 blue and black. It has flying vigilance, and whenever you surveil, which means you look at the top card of your library and you can choose to put it back on top or in your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Mirko Obsessive Theorist. At the beginning of your end step, you may return target creature card with power less than Mirko's from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it, which means that if it would die, you have to exile it instead. So I really love this commander because it has some very interesting things going forward. For one, it has vigilance in blue and black, which is extremely rare. What I also like about it is you get to recur things for free. They do get a finality counter, but you get to recur things for free at each end step if you get your stuff in the graveyard. And it has a payoff for surveilling, which is a mechanic that puts stuff in your graveyard. He is a face commander from one of the precons from Murders at Karlov Manor. So there is a precon built around Mirko. But obviously I upgraded it, and I'm going to show you what the deck looks like right now. So the first group of cards that we're going to look at is what I call single surveil cards. These are cards that when played give you one surveil trigger, which is going to pump up Mirko and is possibly going to fuel your graveyard, or at the very least filter the top of your library. So the first card is Ransom Notes. Now this card was included in all of the precons from Murders at Karlov Manor, and it does a little bit of everything that all those precons do. First of all, when it enters, you surveil 1, which is immediately a trigger for Mirko for 1 mana, which is really good. Next, it's a clue, so you can pay 2 and sacrifice it and draw a card. But it also gives you 2 other options. One is to cloak the top card of your library, which is essentially manifest with Ward 2. Or goad target creature, which is what the Boros deck from the Murders at Karlov Manor precon set does. So it wasn't a precon already, it's only 1 mana, it triggers as soon as I play it. I thought I would just keep it, it's a funny little card. So it's staying in the deck. Next we have Consider. This is a 1 mana instant which cantrips, so you play it and then you draw a card, and before you do that you surveil 1. So again, 1 mana, you get 1 surveil trigger. Very efficient, instant speed, you can do it at your opponent's end step before your turn, and it replaces itself, so it's just a great inclusion. Next we have Otherworldly Gaze, and this card is even better than Consider, because it doesn't draw you cards, but it surveils 3. And surveil 3 means you look at 3 cards, and then you choose which ones you put back on top, in whatever order, and which ones you put in the graveyard. But what makes it so good is that it also has flashback for 1 in the blue, so for just 1 more mana, you can recast it from your graveyard, and then you have to exile it. But that means you get 2 surveil triggers out of 1 card if you play it on 2 different instances. So I love Otherworldly Gaze. I think this card is actually just good generically in any deck, but it's especially good in Mirko, obviously, because you can get multiple triggers. Now, Mirko's ability does not trigger multiple times if you surveil multiple cards. So surveil 1 and surveil 3 just gives 1 Mirko trigger, but it triggers at every instance. So it will trigger when you hardcast it, it will trigger when you flashback it, when you flash it back. Next is the first creature of our list, Fairy Dream Thief. 1 mana, when it enters the battlefield, you surveil 1. It's a 1/1 with flying. And it also has another ability. You can pay 2 and a black, exile it from your graveyard, draw a card, and lose a life. Now this is something that you may or may not want to do. You know, being a creature with 1 power, it's a very easy target for Mirko to also recur. So you can technically cast this, have a 1/1 blocker, get your Surveil trigger, and then when it dies, you can on your end step recur it, and you get another Surveil trigger from it entering the battlefield a second time. Of course, if it dies afterwards, you will never be able to use the other ability because it comes back with a finality counter, and when it dies, it gets exiled instead. Next, we have Dog Detective. Same thing, it's a 2/1 for 2 mana. When it enters, you Surveil 2, and it has another ability that allows you to take it back into your hand from your graveyard if an opponent draws their second card each turn. Again, if you have this in your graveyard, you have to make a choice whether you want to take it back to your hand and hardcast it again to get another Surveil trigger, or if you want to recur it with Mirko. A lot of it will depend on how many +1/+1 counters you already have on Mirko, because the creature that you recur has to have lower power than Mirko, and Dog Detective has 2 power, which makes it an easy target. If you have a lot of +1/+1 counters on Mirko already and you want to get bigger stuff, then it might be worth it to use the second ability from Dog Detective. Otherwise, you can just recur it and you get your second trigger. Next up, we have Curate. This is essentially Consider Premium. It's a 2 mana Surveil 2, draw a card, instant speed. It's the same as Consider, a little more expensive, and use Surveil 2. Next, we have a split card. So this is Discovery or Dispersal. Now, the part that I use most with this card is Discovery, which is exactly the same as Curate, Surveil 2, draw a card. The only difference is it's a sorcery, so you cannot play it at instant speed. And it costs 1 and a hybrid Dimir, so you could technically cast it for black. So that's what it does. Very efficient. Sorcery speed is a little annoying, but again, pretty good. 2 mana, Surveil 2, draw a card, Mirko trigger, etc. The other half is Dispersal. Now this is a 5 mana instant. It says each opponent returns a non-land permanent they control with the highest mana value among permanents they control to its owner's hand, then discards a card. So this is removal, sort of. It bounces 3 non-land permanents with the biggest mana value, and then everyone discards a card. So that's decent. It's an instant. It's 5 mana. If it comes up, by all means, it's fine to use it. But I personally just cast Discovery on my turn most of the time. Next we have Notion Rain. 1 blue-black, Surveil 2, then draw 2 cards. Notion Rain deals 2 damage to you. I think this is just a solid sorcery. Drawing 2 cards for 3 mana is acceptable. You take 2 damage. It's slightly better than Night's Whisper and or Signing Blood. It deals 2 damage to you, but you also get to Surveil 2 before you do it. So you get a trigger, you draw 2 cards, you have the top deck filter, you have the graveyard fuel, you have the Mirko trigger, you have the card advantage, and it only costs 2 life. Next on our list is Ephara's Dispersal. This is a 3 mana instance. It costs 2 and a blue, but it costs 2 generic mana less to cast if it targets an attacking creature. So if someone is attacking and you cast this targeting one of the attacking creatures, it only costs 1 blue mana, and it says return target creature to its owner's hand and then Surveil 2. So this is removal, slightly inefficient sometimes it's not. It's an unsummon with Surveil, which specifically in this deck is acceptable. I would probably not recommend it in any other deck given the alternatives, even in blue. But in this deck, I figured it's worth it because you get a Surveil trigger. Next is Price of Fame, and Price of Fame is also a removal spell. It costs 3 and a black, but it costs 2 generic mana less to cast if it targets a legendary creature, so you can target commanders with this, and then you only pay 1 and a black. It says destroy target creature, Surveil 2. So this is, when it comes to legendary creatures, just a generic 2 mana black removal spell. We've seen a ton of them, but with upside. And the upside being that you Surveil 2. Of course, the downside is that it costs 4 mana if you target anything else. Then we have Pile On, very similar, also costs 3 and a black, but it has Convoke, so it can cost even 0 mana if you tap 4 creatures, one of which has to be black. So all the creatures you tap pay for 1 generic or a mana of their color. And it says destroy target creature or planeswalker, Surveil 2. So this is almost free removal. This was included in the pre-con and I kept it. Next up, another split card, Connive Concoct. So in this instance, I will to cast the second half of this card, but let's read them both. Connive, gain control of target creature with power 2 or less. It doesn't say until end of turn, so if you gain control of the best creature on the board, it's yours forever. The other half, Concoct. Here's where Surveil comes in again. It says Surveil 3, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Without finality counter, without anything. So this is Recursion and Surveil for 5 mana. Very good. Next up we have Dream Eater. This is a slightly bigger creature. It costs 6 mana. It's a 4/3 with flash and flying. When Dream Eater enters the battlefield, Surveil 4, which is excellent. And when you do, you may return target non-land permanent that opponent controls to its owner's hand. So this is bounce for any non-land permanent on ETB after you Surveil 4. It's a very good card, but it's 6 mana. So what I usually want to do with this is Surveil it into the graveyard, and then when Mirko has power 5 or more, recur it for free, and when it enters I Surveil 4, I remove something, and now I have this big creature and a big Mirko. Next up we have Mission Briefing, and Mission Briefing is an interesting card. It was included in the pre-con. Sometimes it fails and sometimes it's extremely good. So what it does is for blue at instant speed, you Surveil 2, then choose an instant or sorcery card in your graveyard. You may cast it this turn, but you have to pay the mana for it. And then if that spell would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. So it essentially Surveils 2 and then gives an instant or sorcery flashback, with the flashback cost being the mana cost, more or less. But it's tough. Sometimes it does exactly what you want to do, but because it's an instant, I tend to hold it until I need something, and then I cast it, and then I get my removal spell back, or I get my counter spell back or something. But that just makes for very awkward, inefficient mana allocation. But aside from that, I mean, it's an interesting card. It still gives me Surveil 2 at instant speed. It's cheap. Even when you don't get something from the graveyard, it's still value. So I'm keeping it in the deck for now. So yeah. And speaking of counterspells, here's Sinister Sabotage. 1 blue, counter target spell. Sounds like cancel, but it has a Surveil 1 written right under that. So again, not the most efficient counterspell by any stretch of the imagination, but just because it gives you a Surveil trigger, it is worth it to run in this deck, in my opinion. The next category of cards is repeatable Surveil. So we start off with Snarling Gorehound. So this comes from the Murders at Karlov Manor main set. It's a 1/1 for 1, it's a dog. It has Menace, and whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, Surveil 1. And we have a bunch of those. So if you manage to drop this on turn 1 and then cast another small creature, or cast Mirko and then cast another small creature, you will be able to Surveil multiple times. This card has given me so much value in the games that I saw it, that I'm really happy to have it in this deck. Next up, Sinister Starfish. So this card was in the pre-con. It's a very simple card. It costs 2 mana, it's a 0/3, and you can tap it to Surveil 1, and that's it. You keep it up as a blocker, and on the last end step, you tap it, you Surveil 1, Mirko gets a counter, and then it's your turn. Love it. Next up is a Ravnica Classic, Nightveil Sprite. Nightveil Sprite is a 2 mana, 1/2 fairy rogue with flying, and whenever it attacks, you Surveil 1. It's an attack trigger, so it doesn't have to deal damage. It probably will because it has flying, and I've had plenty of games where I had Nightveil Sprite on turn 2 and then Mirko on turn 3, attack with Nightveil Sprite, get a counter, and in the most ideal scenario, you surveilled a small creature into the graveyard and now you recur it, and that's just perfection. But even if you don't, growing Mirko starting the turn that it enters is the best thing you can hope for in the opening. Next up we have an enchantment. It's a Case card. Case of the Shifting Visage. It costs 1 blue blue, and immediately it says at the beginning of your upkeep, Surveil 1. And then if you have 15 or more cards in your graveyard at the beginning of your end step, the case is solved. And when it's solved, it says whenever you cast a non-legendary creature spell, copy that spell. Now, even if you don't get to that point because your graveyard doesn't grow fast enough, just being able to surveil every single upkeep is going to make Murko bigger and bigger and bigger. It's going to fill your graveyard more and more and more. It's going to filter your draws. So cards like these are extremely valuable in this deck. Which is also why I added Think Tank. This is an old card. It has the old templating. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may put a card into your graveyard. It has been errata. All the cards that say this have been errata to say Surveil. So Think Tank is just another enchantment that at the beginning of my upkeep allows me to surveil every single turn, which grows Murko, which fills the graveyard, which filters the draws, etc. Then we have Search for Azcanta. Same identical thing. Except it costs 2 mana. So it's the same thing, but cheaper. I love it. It's good that they errataed it. It works well. It has a backside with a land. Frankly, I have never transformed it. Never had to, never will. Next up we have the Grim Captain's Locker. So this card was in the Pirate Pre-Con from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And it's a 4 mana legendary artifact. You can tap it to Surveil 1, which is almost the only thing I use it for. But you can also tap it, and then until end of turn, each creature card in your graveyard gains escape. 3 and a black, exile 4 other cards from your graveyard. So what that means is if you pay 3 and a black and you exile 4 cards, you can recur a creature. That's usually not what I do with it. What I do with it is usually the Sinister Starfish thing, except of course it's not a blocker, it's more expensive, etc. But I love to tap this to Surveil 1, get a trigger off. Next up we have Clandestine Meddler. So I have both versions, the white curtain and the red curtain. Makes no difference really, but I thought it was funny that they printed it with in 2 variants. When it enters the battlefield, suspect up to 1 other target creature you control. So you have to suspect another creature that you control, which means it gains menace and it can't block. So this is interesting because sometimes I'm not sure whether this card is good or whether it's worth it to run this, because it is 3 mana. But it does give me a Surveil trigger whenever 1 or more suspected creatures I control attack. I have no other ways of suspecting creature, so this card is pushing it in my mind. But the times that I have ran it, I was able to utilize it. Menace is just not as strong as flying, for example. If you can suspect Nightveil Sprite or a creature that you want to attack with anyway, then I think it's very good. This card is much better in my opinion. It's Unshakable Tail, 2 and a black for a 3/2 zombie detective. When it enters and at the beginning of your upkeep, you Surveil 1. Whenever 1 or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from your library, investigate. And then you can pay 2 and sacrifice a clue and return Unshakable Tail from your graveyard to your hand. Usually that's not what I do. Usually what I do is if it's in the graveyard and I can recur it with Murko, I just do that instead. But this card is really good. The only thing is, don't forget to investigate when 1 or more creatures are put into your graveyard from your library. Which means when you surveil with something else and you say I'm going to put this in the graveyard and it's a creature because you want to target it with Murko later, don't forget to investigate. I've seen people do that. I've been guilty of it myself. It's not only a repeatable surveil piece, it's also card advantage. Speaking of card advantage, Dimir Strandcatcher. Fairy Rogue, 3/3. It costs 2 and 2 hybrid Dimir. It has flying, and whenever you attack, you surveil X, where X is the number of opponents being attacked. So in Commander, it's usually going to be between 1 and 3. At the beginning of each end step, if 3 or more cards were put into your graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield this turn, draw a card. So when you read this, the first thing you think is, okay, so I want to attack 3 people, I want to surveil, and I want to put 3 cards in the graveyard, and then I can draw a card. That is not the only way. Instants and sorceries count as well. They go from the stack to the graveyard. And what Dimir Strandcatcher says, if 3 or more cards were put into your graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield. So yes, the library counts, but any other zone counts as well. If you discard, that counts. So keep that in mind, and Dimir's Strandcatcher will draw you cards consistently. And the last card in this category, frankly the best card, maybe the best card in the deck, Doom Whisperer. So this is an incredible Surveil engine. It has flying and trample. It's a 6/6 for 5 mana. But the most interesting part about this is you can Surveil 2 at the cost of 2 life. It doesn't say do this once each turn. You don't have to tap it. You don't have to pay mana. All you have to do is pay 2 life and you Surveil 2. When this is on the battlefield, you can go nuts. You can pay 2 life, Surveil 2, pay 2 life, Surveil 2, pay 2 life, Surveil 2. You have so much life in Commander that that's not going to be an issue, and Mirko is going to grow every single time you do this. Even when you find the cards you want and you keep them on top, you can just do it. You can just leave the cards alone and grow Mirko, grow Mirko, grow Mirko. So I love Doom Whisperer. I believe it's the best card in the deck, probably. It was included in the precon. It's incredible. Moving on to another category. So we're doing all this surveilling, and we have a bunch of cards that surveil once, we have a bunch of cards that surveil multiple times, but do we have payoffs? Yes, we do. So aside from Mirko being the biggest payoff or the most accessible payoff, because it starts in the command zone, we have more of that. We have Thoughtbound Phantasm. This is a 2/2 for 1 mana. It has Defender, so it can't attack. But whenever you surveil, it gets a +1/+1 counter. And if it has 3 or more +1/+1 counters on it, it can attack as though it didn't have Defender. So you have a blocker, you have a growing blocker, and eventually you have an attacker that's at least a 5/5 for 1 mana. If you surveil 3 or more times, which you're going to do guaranteed. Next up, Dimir Spybug. For a blue and a black, a 1/1 insect with flying, menace, and whenever you surveil, it gets a +1/+1 counter. It's the same as Mirko. It doesn't have the recursion. It's 1/1. It's cheaper. It's a baby Mirko. Next we have Copycatchers. So Copycatchers is an interesting card. It's a 2/1 fairy for 2 with flying, and whenever you surveil, you may pay 1 in a blue. And if you do, create a token that's a copy of Copycatchers. So this card is very interesting. If you are playing control like I do, and you have a bunch of open mana on your opponent's turns, and then you know the turn comes back to you, and you still have open mana on the last end step, you have all these ways of surveilling at instant speed, and then you can just sink mana into this and make 2/1 tokens. I think this card is actually easy to undervalue. I think that when I cast it, people don't respect it as much as they should, and then they get overwhelmed by an army of tokens. Whispering Snitch. 1/3 for 2. Vampire Rogue. Whenever you surveil for the first time each turn, Whispering Snitch deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. The small value creature, love it. It has 1 power, you can recur it easily. It's another payoff for surveilling. It's just really good. If you cast it on turn 2, it does an incredible amount of damage. It's justifiable to use your removal on it, but it feels bad. Okay, next up we have Devourer of Memory from Theros Beyond Death. This is a 2/1 nightmare for 2 mana, and whenever 1 or more cards are put into your graveyard from your library, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and it can't be blocked this turn. It also has a second ability. You can pay 1 blue black and mill 1. So this card is actually really interesting because you don't see it as a surveil payoff immediately, but what it does is it triggers off of cards going into your graveyard from your library, which you will do with surveil at some point. And giving it +1/+1 until end of turn and can't be blocked multiple times means you can have a very big unblockable attacker. Darkblade Agent, Human Assassin, 2/3. As long as you've surveilled this turn, Darkblade Agent has Death Touch, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. And this is really good because with Death Touch, people are wary to block if they don't have, like, you know, blocking tokens or anything like that. Even if they do, it's a 2/3, so you need a big creature to block it, and then Death Touch will kill the big creature. And if they don't block it, you draw a card. Disinformation Campaign. Okay, so I'm not sure if this card is good or not. I think when it goes off, it is. But it's a little clunky because you have to recast it multiple times. So when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and everyone discards a card, and then whenever you surveil, you return it back to your hand. So it's card advantage, but it's slow and you have to recast it over and over, but it does make your opponents discard. I'm not sure if this is better than Phyrexian Arena, which I personally am not a fan of. But it's a Surveil payoff, so if there's one deck where this is going to go, it has to be this deck. So that's why I have it. Next up is Dreadhound. So this one is similar to Devourer of Memory. It doesn't necessarily have a Surveil trigger, but it has a trigger when a creature card is put into a graveyard from a library. So it works with mill and it works with Surveil. When it enters, you mill 3 cards, and then whenever a creature dies or a creature is put into a graveyard from a library, each opponent loses 1 life. It's a payoff, it's good. You want to put creatures in your graveyard because you want to recur them with Mirko. So it fits into the deck very well. It is 6 mana to hardcast, so this is also probably going to be a target for Mirko to recur. But you can hardcast it and then you have a 6/6, which is not bad. And of course, Sir Conrad the Grim. This card is an awesome commander. It's awesome in the 99. It's great value whenever another creature dies, or if a creature is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, such as your library, or when a creature cards leave your graveyard. For example, if Mirko recurs it, then it deals 1 damage to each opponent. You can also pay 1 and a black, and then each player mills a card, which is graveyard fuel for you. If you get a good creature that you can recur at the same end step, this is going to be more value. This card is extremely good. It's kill on sight. People are scared of it, and they should. Okay, on to the next category. And the next category is creatures you want to target with Mirko to recur. So these are creatures that have usually a very good ETB effect, or ETB ability rather, that can trigger when you hardcast them, they can trigger when you recur them, you can do both sometimes. And we're going to start off with Baleful Strix. Now, I really like this card because I had it signed by Ristic Studies at MagicCon, so it has a bit of a sentimental value to me. You can replace this with whatever other creature with a good ETB, but there's a case to be made that Baleful Strix is just a very good card in any Dimir deck. One of the best blockers in the game. It has flying, it has death touch, it replaces itself when it enters, and if you do it twice, you're actually up a card. So I'm just happy with this. It's never going to leave the deck. I'm always going to play with this Baleful Strix. Next up we have Accursed Marauder. So this is essentially Flashback Marauder for 2 mana instead of 3. It's a zombie warrior, 2/1 for 2. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a non-token creature. This includes yourself. So what you usually do is you hardcast this, you sacrifice itself, and then at the end step you bring it back with Mirko, and everyone has to sacrifice 2 things, and you just re-sacrifice Accursed Marauder. Now it's exiled because of the finality counter, but everyone's down 2 non-token creatures, and you feel on top of the world. Great removal. Old Drifter, the quintessential ETB creature. When it enters, draw 2 cards. You can evoke it for 2 in the blue, which means you cast it for 2 in the blue. It enters, you draw 2 cards, then you have to sacrifice it, and in the same end step, you bring it back with Mirko. You draw 2 more cards, and now you have a Bull Drifter. Solemn Simulacrum. I don't need to explain this card probably to anyone who plays Magic, but for those of you who are new or are not familiar with this card, when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a basic land, you put it into the battlefield tapped, and when it dies, you draw a card. So what's important about this is, yeah, it's lovely to hardcast it, search for a land, let it die, and then recur it, and then search for a land and let it die again. But don't forget that the second time it dies, you will not draw a card because it won't die. It will be exiled instead, unless you can remove the finality counter somehow. Massacre Worm. When Massacre Worm enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, that person loses 2 life. Great ETB, great static ability. It's one of those cards that is absolutely a target for Murko because hard casting it for 3 black is challenging. But the way Murko grows, it's very doable to recur 6 power creatures. And last but not least, Clever Impersonator. Now the precon came with a bunch of clone creatures, but I think Clever Impersonator is the best clone creature because it can copy any non-land permanent. It's not extremely good to hard cast it for 4 mana and then copying like a Soul Ring or something because it's 4 mana. But you know when it's good? When you cast it for free, or when you have it enter the battlefield for free. If this is in your graveyard and you recur it, you can have it enter as anything. And if you have it enter as a Soul Ring, for example, or as a strong enchantment, it's going to be difficult to remove and it's going to give you value. So the next category is ramp, cards that bring you ahead of the mana curve. Of course, we are Dimir, so we are relying a lot on artifacts, but that's not all we're doing. So obviously we have Soul Ring, which taps for 2 colorless. We have Wayfarer's Bauble. It costs 1, you can pay 2, tap, sacrifice it, search for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield tapped. Another good 1-drop. Arcane Signet, auto included every deck. Dimir Signet, again, we are in Dimir, we need the mana, it's 2 mana value, mana rock, needs to go in the deck. Talisman of Dominance, very similar, slightly better because you can use it immediately, maybe. Auto include pretty much. Dowsing Dagger. So Dowsing Dagger is different. This is a 2 mana equipment. When it enters, target opponent gets 2/0/2 green plant creature tokens with Defender. They don't have reach, which is important because what you want to do is pay 2 more and equip Dowsing Dagger to Murko because it's a flying creature. It gets +2/+1, and then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may transform Dowsing Dagger. And when you transform Dowsing Dagger, you actually get the Lost Veil. And Lost Veil is a land that taps for 3 mana of any 1 color, which is incredible. I love Dowsing Dagger, especially in decks that have flying commanders. And another ramp piece from Modern Horizons 3, Warren Soul Trader. This is a zombie goblin wizard. You can pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature, and make a treasure. And you know what else? You can do this any number of times at instant speed. So even when it looks like you're tapped out, if you have creatures to sacrifice, you have mana. People often overlook that. This is an excellent piece of ramp in black, and I think it should go in every deck. I think it's a staple already. Another piece of ramp for control decks, especially if you play at instant speed, if you play on your opponent's turn, is Sphinx of the Second Sun. So what this does is, at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, this is tricky, there is an additional beginning phase after this phase. So what this means is the ability triggers at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, of your second main phase. But that doesn't mean you get an extra beginning phase now. First you finish that main phase, then you get an extra beginning phase, so you untap everything, including your lands, that's why it's ramp. You get an upkeep with all the triggers, you draw a card, and then you go to the end step. So that happens between the second main phase and the end step, not before the second main phase. This is very important. And it's ramp because it untaps everything, and if you have instants in your hand, which you will, that means you have extra mana for the turn cycle. Shadow of the Second Sun. Same identical thing on an enchantment, and it only costs 6 instead of 8. So the downside is you cannot recur it with Murko. The upside is it's cheaper. Our next category is going to be counter spells, because this is a control deck after all. The first counter spell we have is classic counter spell, blue counter target spell. We already saw Sinister Sabotage before. That counts as a Surveil piece and as a counter spell, obviously. Now we're getting into just generic counter spells. So we have counterspell, negate, counter target non-creature spell. People don't like negate because it's quote narrow unquote. I argue most of the spells you want to counter are non-creature anyway. It's efficient. It does what it needs to do. I have never been unhappy with negate. Are there better things? Yes, there are, but I think it's fine to just run normal negate. I would rather run negate than an offer you can't refuse, and this is something most people don't share, but I'm convinced. Counterpoint. So this counterspell was included in the precon. It was, I believe, the only one included in the precon. It says counter target spell, and then you may cast a creature, instant, sorcery, or planeswalker spell from your graveyard with mana value less than or equal to the countered spell mana value without paying its mana cost. So essentially what this does is you pay 5 mana, you counter a spell, and then you look at the mana value of what you countered, and you can get something for free from your graveyard that costs the same or less. It's fine. It's 5 mana, but it's fine. It gives you something. I remember I played my first match with this deck when it was the Intact Precon, and I used Counterpoint at a crucial point in the game, and I got back a Reanimator spell that got back Grave Titan, and then I had 3 bodies on the field. It's an interesting card. I like it. I'm thinking about buying extra copies for other decks, but I'm not quite convinced yet. But yeah, it's a counterspell for 5 mana. Flare of Denial. Amazing card in this deck specifically because we have a bunch of creatures and we have a bunch of blue creatures as well. So you may sacrifice a non-token blue creature rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Counter target spell. So what is good about this is, imagine the play pattern from before. Now this is not Magical Christmas Land. This actually happens, and it happens more than you would think. You evoke Muldrifter, you get to your end step, you bring Muldrifter back, you've drawn 4 cards now, and then someone wants to destroy Mirko or whatever, and then you sacrifice their Muldrifter again for Flare of Denial. As I say, these are not utopian scenarios. This actually happened. Spell Swindle. I love Spell Swindle, okay? I have it in many of my decks where I don't run green because it's also ramp. And yes, I do count Spell Swindle as ramp. So for those of you who don't know, Spell Swindle, counter target spell, and then create X treasure tokens, which are artifacts that you can tap and sacrifice for mana, where X is the mana value of the spell that you countered. So if someone casts a 5 mana spell and you counter it, you get 5 treasures. Now, Spell Swindle does cost 5 mana itself, so it is often seen as highly inefficient to keep up all that mana, but we are playing control. We are keeping up our mana. And look, I consider Spell Swindle a budget version of Mana Drain. Now, people are gonna lynch me for it. Obviously, Mana Drain is way more efficient. 5 mana is way worse than 2. Treasures are better than colorless mana, especially colorless mana that you have to spend in one turn. I don't care. I consider Spell Swindle the budget Mana Drain. Next up, we have Jwari Disruption. Now, this card is in the deck mainly to function as a land. It's not a very good counterspell, but if you pull it off, of course it feels great. If you don't pull it off, it's not a dead card. It's a tap land. You can afford it. Your control deck, run Jwari Disruption, play it as a tap land. Don't be sad. It's fine. And then of course we have the better version, which is Sink into Stupor, which is better in every way. It counters a spell. Actually, it bounces a spell back to the hand of its owner, which is in some ways worse because they can recast it. In some ways it's better because it gets around can't be countered, but it can also bounce non-land permanents. So it's not only a counter spell, it's also spot removal. It's also a land on the backside, and it can enter untapped if you pay 3 mana. Amazing card, auto include. I play it in every deck. After the counterspell / spot removal card, Sink into Stupor, we're gonna go over some more spot removal. We have seen Pylon and Price of Fame and Ephara's Dispersal earlier, but of course we are Dimir, so we have more interaction. Felder Profane, I believe, is a great improvement over Hagra Mauling. It's an instant, you destroy a creature or a planeswalker, it costs 4 mana, but it's also a land on the backside that can enter tapped or untapped. if you so wish. Not the most efficient targeted removal, but the flexibility makes it worth it to run. Then we have Withering Torment. So Withering Torment, again, in my eyes, huge upgrade compared to Feed the Swarm, because instant speed makes all the difference. It also has a defined number in terms of how much life you lose by destroying a creature or an enchantment. Enchantment removal is important. We have some non-land permanent bounce in blue, but I believe Withering Torment is a very important card if you're not running white or green. Board wipes. Toxic Deluge. So Toxic Deluge and Black Sun's Zenith were both in the precon. I kept Toxic Deluge. You can make an argument that Black Sun's Zenith is also very good. Why are they both good? Well, because they wipe the board not by destroying everything, but in Toxic Deluge's case, you give all creatures -X by paying X amount of life. And Black Sun's Zenith, you sink X amount of mana in it, and then you give X -1 counters to stuff. There are several reasons why this is very good. It gets around indestructible. It still destroys, so if you have death triggers, that's good. Not necessarily the case in this deck, but I would like to have my creatures in the graveyard, for example, rather than exile. And also, because Murko grows so big, you can adjust the number in a way that you can kill everything except Murko. And our next board wipe is Evacuation. So Evacuation is an instant for 5 mana, return all creatures to their owner's hand. Okay, I don't own a Cyclonic Rift, and I don't care to own a Cyclonic Rift. I am happy to run Evacuation. I'm happy to bounce my own stuff. I have finality counters, which disappear when I get my creatures back. I have ETB triggers. Yeah, it's sad to lose the +1/+1 counters on Murko. On the other hand, it's an instant, so I'm just keeping Evacuation in this deck. So far, I've always been happy with it. So now we get to the last category before the lands, which is really a small group of cards. It's just 3 cards that are in the deck just to make the deck better. They don't fit into the other categories, but they help the deck a lot. So one is Scheming Symmetry. Now, this is just one of the many black tutors that you can run. I like Scheming Symmetry because it has the political aspect. You can ask someone to search for a removal card. Or what I also like about it is it puts something on the top of your library. So sometimes I would rather have a Doom Whisperer, for example, in my graveyard than in my hand. So what I then like to do is cast Scheming Symmetry, get that important creature on top of my library, do a Surveil, put it in the graveyard, and then at the end step recur the creature. I'm just happy with it. I haven't regretted putting it in ever. So this is the first of the 3 cards. The second of the 3 cards is Enhanced Surveillance. Now this card doesn't do anything by itself, but you can look at an additional 2 cards each time you surveil. So it only costs 2 mana. So if you drop this on turn 2 and then you cast a Consider, you will surveil 3. If you cast Otherworldly Gaze, you will surveil 5, just because you have this in play. You can also exile it and then shuffle your graveyard back into your library. Now, I haven't found this to be relevant at all. I suppose it could be if like all your counter spells are finished or something like that, but that's really more something for a mill deck. And last but not least, Lightning Greaves, because we gotta protect Murko. Haste is nice, but Shroud is even nicer. So Lightning Greaves, very important card. I put it in the deck, I'm never gonna take it out. And finally, we arrived at the lands in the deck. So I'm gonna start off by showing the utility lands, and then the dual lands, and then I have 17 basics in this deck. Look, I believe in basic lands. If you don't, you don't. I think basic lands are good, also because of some of our ramp pieces like Solemn and Wayfarer's Bauble and Myriad Landscape. So Myriad Landscape enters tapped, it taps for a colorless, you can pay 2, tap and sacrifice it, search for 2 basic lands that share a basic land type and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Temple of the False God, again, ramp. I don't have Ancient Tomb, I don't care about Ancient Tomb, Temple of the False God works. If it doesn't work for you, you're doing something wrong. I'm sorry, it's not that difficult to have 4 different lands, 4 other lands on the battlefield before you drop it. But even if you drop it as your 4th land, you should be able to find your 5th land and have it online the turn afterwards. It's good. Nesting Grounds. So the reason why I put Nesting Grounds in this deck is because you can pay 1 and tap it to move a counter from one permanent to another. What I like about this is that the permanent where the counter goes doesn't have to be yours. So you can put your finality counters on someone else's creature, which is incredibly good, especially if they have a death trigger or something like that. So besides removing the finality counter from your own creature, which is good, it also can mess up someone else's creature. Demolition Field. It can add a colorless mana. You can pay 2 and tap it and destroy a non-basic land. And then you and that land's controller get a basic from your library onto the battlefield untapped. So this is like Field of Ruin, but only you and the affected player search, which is so much better in Commander. And I think Demolition Field is an amazing card. I'm happy they printed it in Foundations. It's a staple. It's an auto-include pretty much, especially in decks that don't have Generous Gift or Chaos Warp or Beast Within. So Dimir decks, essentially. Very good card. Always been happy with it. And even if you don't, if your opponents don't have a Shrine to Nyx or a Mace of Fifth or a Gaia's Cradle or something crazy like that, you don't have to activate it. You still have an untapped land. Conduit Pylons. Okay, so I gotta confess, I don't have the Surveil lands, the Surveil dual lands from Murders at Karlov Manor. I don't care, okay? I'm always checking the prices. They are 25 euros. I'm not gonna spend 25 euros for a Surveil land, okay? This is a Surveil land. It enters untapped, it gives you colorless, but when it enters, you Surveil 1. So, I mean, it's much worse because it doesn't give you colors, but it enters untapped and it surveils. It's the next best thing, isn't it? Tokazia's Dig Site. So this card was in the precon. It's actually perfect for this deck. You can pay 3, tap it, and surveil 1. Now, of course, surveilling 1 for 4 mana is not ideal, but because it's on a land and because you're keeping your mana open anyway, it's just fine. It doesn't enter tapped, so it doesn't hit your tempo. It's a fine card. Vesuva. Alright, so spoiler alert. I'm gonna move on to the dual lands in a bit, and I don't have enough Watery Graves. I ordered them, they are coming, so I will most likely replace Vesuva with a Watery Graves. I included Vesuva in the first place because of Dowsing Dagger. If you pull it off, if you have Lost Veil and then you play Vesuva, you are on top of the world. But that's only one target in my own deck. And yes, sometimes my opponents have incredibly good utility lands or something like that, but I think Vesuva was actually not worth it in this deck. I will replace it with a Watery Grave. I currently only have one Watery Grave and it's in another deck of mine, so that's why. Bazooka Bog, because of course. Now we get to the dual lands. So obviously we have a command tower. Every commander deck needs command tower. And then I should have ordered them from best to worst, where we'll see if I still agree with myself, but the first one, of course, command tower. Next up is Drowned Catacomb. I think it's excellent. It enters tapped on turn 1, it enters untapped on turn 2 because you will have an island or swamp. So it's just an untapped dual land. I love this cycle. Really good. River of Tears. So this was in the precon. I still don't know if it's really good or not. It enters untapped, which is great, but you have to think about when you use it. So it adds blue, but it adds black if you play the land. This includes itself. So if you play it, it adds black. Afterwards, if you want to use it for blue, you need to float before you play your other land. It's a weird card, it's a weird land, it's an untapped dual land, so it's good. It just requires you to think before you act. Shipwreck Marsh from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. This is from the cycle of the slow lands. It enters tapped unless you have 2 or more other lands when you play it, and that will be the majority of the turns, so I think it's just really good. Sunken Hollow. So what's special about these? These are the, I believe they're called Tango lands. If you control 2 or more basic lands, then it enters untapped. Some people don't like these because they don't play enough basics or because they don't want to. For me, Sunken Hollow is good. There is a risk that it still enters tapped on turn 3 or 4, which sucks. So that's why it's below all those other lands, but I do run it in all decks with black and blue that I own. Tainted Isle. So I run Tainted Isle in strictly Dimir. I would not run it in 3-color decks. It taps for a colorless or it taps for either color if you control a swamp. Now, luckily you have enough swamps in this deck that this will work, but it's not reliable in 3+ colors, in my opinion. Darkwater Catacombs. Okay, so I don't like this cycle. I call them signet lands. You have to pay 1, and if you tap it, you get both colors. It's not the worst. I would much rather have the other one. I believe it's called Sunken Ruin, which filters into any color combination. But that card is also, I believe, 17 euros or something like that, 18, which is way too much. But you know, in 2-color decks, this cycle is still acceptable. Like, you want as many dual lands as you can, basically, right? So this is acceptable. Dimir Aqueduct, so bounce lands, in my opinion, auto includes in 2-color decks. In 3-color decks, you need a reason to run them. I do run them in a few 3-color decks that I have, but I have reasons for it. In 2-color decks, I think they're auto-include. They're fine. They guarantee your next land drop. Yeah, they enter tapped. Okay, use your mana before you play them. Choked Estuary. Reveal lands, or snarls if you have the Strixhaven ones. Not good. Not bad, but not that great at all. You have to reveal an island or swamp from your hand. And if this is the only land you have in your hand, or if you don't have basics in your hand, it's gonna enter tapped. It's not great. I only run them in 2-color decks. Same thing as the Signet lands. I do not run reveal lands in 3+ colors. In 2 colors, I think they are still acceptable because they are dual lands. They do enter untapped more often than you would think. They don't suck, but just not that great. And next up we have Temple of the Seat. So as I said, I don't have Surveil lands. I do have Conduit Pylons, and I have Temple of the Seat. I think the temples are still, if you don't want to spend way too much money on your land base, I think they are still the most acceptable variant of tap lands for Commander, because scrying is value. Scrying is value. Let's say that if I were willing to pay for a Surveil land, I would probably replace Temple of the Seat, but I'm not willing to pay for it, so no. And then we have 17 basic lands. So this was my deck list. This was the deck video for Mirko Obsessive Theorist. Again, my favorite style, Dimir control. I hope you enjoyed. You can give me feedback, you can comment on this video. I would really appreciate a like. I would really appreciate if you shared this video with your nerd friends, and I will see you next time. This is KiteTCG, and out.